Lived in Maplewood, New Jersey, with a stepfather and my mother and a brother. And we moved from California to New Jersey because my mother had remarried after our father and she divorced. And so I had a stepfather who essentially brought me up. And went to elementary school, high school, out of high school, and decided to go to Princeton. At the Princeton, and decided that Princeton was 80% service people during the war. V-12 ground for people who were going to go in the military as officers, Marine Corps or Navy. And they went to college for a couple of years at mostly the Ivy League schools all had V-12 units. But I was young in my class, just turned 18 when I got out of high school. Chemistry, physics, and engineering major. So I quit after one term at Princeton and enlisted in the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps took all the people that came into Parris Island as volunteer. So I was ready to be sent to Japan for the invasion of Japan. The 8th Service Regiment were all guys that had had some college physics. Although most of their troops were out in the Pacific fighting us for the Pacific Islands, but they still had a strong military presence in Japan. Once the emperor said, "We have lost the war and we are going to be good people for the Americans." So we had this very good experience when we got off the boat of having the Japanese welcoming us. They knew they were going to get beaten. They knew they weren't going to last the way we'd come across the Pacific, island after island after island, and we'd gotten all the way to Okinawa by the time we dropped the bombs, and our troops we were on the first boat that went into the Sasebo Naval Base. The 2nd Marine Division, which I was assigned to in the 8th Service Regiment. So we had a very interesting start because the Japanese were not, they knew they'd lost the war, and once the emperor said, "We've lost the war, be nice to the Americans," they were. It was very, very different than our situation with Russia in Europe. I mean, which the rest of your friends are going to talk to, because the other guys that are doing what I'm doing were younger than I, and they were involved in the army, usually in Europe, against the Russians, and the Russians were coming in to Germany from one side, and the Americans and British were coming in from the other side. And that's what they're going to be talking about.
Yeah.
And I'm going to a place where we were welcomed by the Japanese.
What was that like for you? Like, did you know what was going on in Russia?
Yeah, we had enough. We had a newspaper, the overseas edition of the Army newspaper. We got copies of it about once a week, and a lot of telling what's going on in Europe. Yes.
Make sure if I ask you a question, it would be helpful, in your answer to kind of repeat.
Can you talk a little louder, please?
Yeah, sorry. If I ask you a question in your answer, if you could kind of repeat the question. So, for example, thank you.
Yeah, it just makes it easier for us to edit it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, your question has to do with did we know what was going on in Europe at the time? And yes, we did. We had good newspapers published by the U.S. Army in Tokyo, sent it out to all the American troops that were in Japan, various bases where we were in the southern island, a big naval base. There were American troops were in every one of the other Japanese military facilities to make sure they didn't sabotage us.
What was a day in the life for you?
What was a day in my life?
Yeah.
Well, I was very lucky. I had a fair amount of exposure to the hardware that we found in military bases. I'd been fooling around with guns. I was a hunter. I was one of the marksmen in our platoon at boot camp. I was one of the top marksmen because I'd done a lot of shooting as a civilian before the war. So it was a fun experience to be part of this decommissioning of this big naval base. I was given the job. I had two assistants, one female girl who'd been in the she had been a student in a university in Japan, and she was my assistant in my tool room, looking after all the tools we had to use for things we were going to take apart and try to see how they worked. And then I had a male assistant who had been in the Japanese army and came back. We had been wounded, and so he was very happy to be free, and he was happy to be working in my tool room rather than be out in the street looking for a job.
Is there anyone you looked up to during this time period?
Yeah,
Any what?
Anyone you looked up to who you admired?
during this time period?
Say that again?
Was there anyone you looked up to during this time period you admired?
Well, the one person that I had trouble admiring was MacArthur. MacArthur was in charge of all our troops in Japan, and he had during the war with Japan in the islands, MacArthur tried to commandeer the U.S. Navy to do his bidding, and he was an Army general, and it didn't go too well. And you read stories about MacArthur's time during World War II in the Pacific, and you don't find too many people that are very excited about what he did. And so he was in charge of the U.S. Army, Navy, Marine Corps, everything in Japan as we went into Japan. And he had his office in Tokyo, and we were down on the southern island. But where do you want to take that?
Anywhere you want.
You what?
Anywhere you want. What do you think is a lesson that we could all learn from what you learned?
Well, the main thing we learned was that people that are interested in conquering the whole western part of the world, all the islands, China, they already had conquered China, and they were the conquering heroes everywhere. We thought they were going to bomb the United States too, because when they bombed Pearl Harbor, that was sort of the beginning of maybe the Japanese were going to land on the Pacific coast. Well, they knew they couldn't conquer us on the Pacific by landing on the Pacific coast. So, where did you want to take that? Who was I? Ask me that question again.
Oh, who you had looked up to before?
Well, I was pleased to see the Japanese so accepting of defeat. We didn't know that. We were issued carbines when we got on the troop ship going to Japan, and as soon as we were going to land in Japan, we were given live ammunition. And within a week, we turned back all our live ammunition. There had been no problem at all with the Japanese in Japan. There are a few stories. I've got a couple of good books written by American sailors that were captured by the Japanese and sent to prison camps in Japan. And they had a rough time of it. The Japanese did not treat them very well. But of course, once we got there and freed these American service people, they had a very happy time. The emperor says, we've lost the war. The Japanese people, okay, what can we do now? And they started rebuilding Japan, and did quite a job of it. Japan came from a small losing nation to a very lively powerhouse in the world of commerce, because they developed so many things after the war, made so many good cars and good airplanes and all kinds of things they did well once they were free from an aggressive mode that their military had put them in before the war or during the war. When I was in high school, we had air raid drills. Bells would go off in the high school, and everybody get under their desk. And then when it turned out, oh, this was just a drill. Okay, you come out under your desk and go back to work. Oh, and my mother was involved in a women's driving group that because during the war we had a shortage of tires, we had a shortage of gasoline. It was all being used for the military, and so the civilians, those of us, I was in high school, couldn't get new tires for cars and so forth. Matter of fact, I dropped a station wagon that my stepfather had in the garage. I was changing the tires. You rotate the tires more often. If you can't get new tires, you keep rotating them. And so I kept rotating them, and I had a jack. I was jacking up the whole rear end of the car at once, and it fell off the jacks, and I lost part of a fingernail because my hand was in underneath the car falling off the jack. So that was my only war injury.
How long were you in the war?
4 years. 3.5.
Nice.
Did you wish you were there longer, shorter?
Well, I told you, I got out of high school, went to Princeton for a term, quit to join the Marine Corps as an enlisted man, and because I'd had some physics, I was put into radio repair, and that was a two-year course in various schools around the country, learning all about radios. And it was a good experience for me, the Marine Corps lessons I'd learned. And I didn't have anybody shoot at me, and I didn't have to shoot at anybody.
When you were in high school and at Princeton, do you remember watching or hearing anything on the radio about what was going on?
Oh, yes. Yeah, when you were my age, I was 16, 17, 18, and 21 when I got out of the Marine Corps, and then went back to college. And so I was about 22 when I got out of college. I should have gotten out of college 2 years earlier, but it's not so bad.
Do you remember hearing anything about the space race?
There wasn't any. Yeah, that was after the war.
Yeah.
Not during the war.
Do you remember the Berlin Wall coming down?
Oh, yes.
What was that like?
Well, that was a U.S. and Russian, and it was a big thing. I went over, my wife and I started when I started my own company about 5 years after I got out of the Marine Corps, and I ended up having some customers in Europe. And so Polly and I went over to visit these customers, and there were some plants in Germany that had been in the Russian zone. And we got to go visit them, and they were communist thinking. You could tell it was a different kind of thinking than we had. But the rest of Europe was so happy to see us. France was so happy to be freed from Russian domination. I had some friends that were a year ahead of me, and I was in the Boy Scouts right all the way through high school, and I had friends that were a year ahead of me in the scouting movement. And when they got out of high school, they went into the 10th Mountain Division, and a few of them were killed in Italy, coming up the boot of Italy, when the Italian troops were being supplied by the Germans to keep the American troops from going up Italy and then conquering that part of Europe from the back door.
So, do you want to and start by saying the background of the
Like the war you're talking about, like we know about it because we did a little research, so we would know what you're talking about and stuff. But do you mind just telling us a little bit, like the background of this war,
what happened, why?
like who it was?
You mean why World War II?
Yeah.
Like the conflict of it.
Well, we, the Americans, were sitting here under Churchill in England and Roosevelt, our president. We're sitting, had a lot of conversations, secret conversations with each other, but Churchill was very anxious to get America into the war. And we had ships going over to France before France was conquered, and then over to England. We had ships going to Russia up around the Norwegian coast into Murmansk, lend-lease goods into Russia, ammunition mostly into Russia. That was necessary to keep the Russians fighting the Germans, because the Germans, as you know, came off a coast conquering Russia by going back into Moscow. I mean, and now we were at peace then, and then it wasn't until the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor that we really were in the war. We were helping Britain a lot, but when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, then we had to be in the war, and we had to be in the war on two fronts, Pacific and Europe. So if it hadn't been for the Japanese, I don't know what would have happened. If the Japanese had not bombed Pearl Harbor and attacked us in the Pacific, would we have stayed at peace much longer? Probably not, because the Brits were going to lose. The Russians, the Germans were bombing England all the time, and they could have wiped out England any time. So, because the Japanese attacked us in Pearl Harbor, then we got in the war, and then we were able to give more support to England, and that kept the Germans from conquering England.
Did you ever participate in any protests?
Protests? No.
Any sit-ins?
No, I was a good boy. I was in the Boy Scouts. I was enlisted in the Marine Corps. I didn't have any protests to get involved in.
How do you think everything you've done in your past has shaped who you are today?
Oh, it has. It has. I mean, I learned so much in my Navy radio schools. I was able to stay ahead of the development of peaceful use of atomic energy, and able to see what could be done with radios to make the world a better place to live in. So it was all positive as far as I was concerned. The trying to figure out what the atomic bomb was all about.
Oh yeah, we'd love to know.
We were on a ship going from San Diego to Hawaii when the bombs were dropped. And we were a bunch of privates in the Marine Corps going to get aboard ships in Hawaii to go attack Japan. And then the bombs were dropped. The Japanese collapsed pretty quickly. And Hawaii Why were we? What was your basic question?
I asked if you had anything to add, and you said something about the atomic bomb.
Yes.
Yeah, the atomic bombs. Okay.
Yeah.
So here we were. We'd all had college physics. We knew a little bit about how you might build an atomic bomb, but none of us. We were all just out of high school, really early college, so we would not have been involved. When I got back to Princeton after the war, most of the professors I had in chem engineering, chemistry, and physics had all been involved in the war effort in one way or another. One of them developed synthetic rubber. The guy who was one of my main coaches in my engineering courses. It would have been the guy who developed the synthetic rubber plants down along the Gulf Coast. So the college professors that were physicists and chemists and so forth were the ones that helped us win the war. I was just, a PFC and then a corporal. So we didn't get into stuff like that. But we did in our this little group of guys I was with in the naval base. They'd all had college. They'd all had college physics. And every time we'd get a new book or a new newspaper about what was the atom bomb all about, this is after the bomb was dropped and after the bombs were dropped and after the Japanese had quit, we had all this opportunity to study whenever we got some news from home with books or the daily newspaper from the Army and so forth. It would tell a lot of the secrets were out then, and they'd tell how the bomb worked and all the history of the building the atom bomb and developing it. I'm fascinated later on in life when I was doing business on the West Coast. A couple of times when my wife was with me, we'd go to the Los Alamos base in where was that? Los Alamos would have been in
New Mexico.
California. No, it was in New Mexico. And go through the base, and it was open for visitors, and go through all of the research that was done to develop the atom bomb.
Shelters.
Oh, I'm sorry. I told you I don't have my hearing
It's all
aids.
right.
I should have put them on. Bomb shelters. We had bomb shelters in Maplewood, New Jersey when I was in high school. Mm-hmm. We had some of the basement rooms in the high school were outfitted. We had beds, had food prepared ahead of time so that if Russians came over and hit us on the West Coast, we could go in the basement of the high school to get away from the bombers.
Did you ever have to go down there?
No, we tried trials. I mean, once they
Yeah.
were built, we had like a fire drill. You'd
Yeah,
have a fire
a drill.
drill today, right?
Yeah, we have drills.
You have fire drills today in school?
Yeah, we
Okay.
go in your basement.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we had
With your cars.
bomb shelter drills, but this was when I was in high school.
Yeah.
So I think we have to start wrapping it up now.
Go ahead, wrap me. Where do you want to wrap me?